Hello and welcome. My name is Alan, and we are back with more The Massacre at El Mozote. This is Tuesday's video. We're not too far behind. I'm getting us caught back up here slowly but surely. I told you I would. Actually, I don't think I've said that, but you knew I would. Anyway, let's go ahead and jump right into this. Alright. The Salvadorans, it seems clear, are giving the Americans a conspiratorial wink, but McKay doesn't seem to get it. Or pretends he doesn't. Instead, he blunders on, venturing to ask Monterosa if any prisoners had been taken. At this, the colonel again assumed the adamant demeanor and suggested that RO consult with the general staff to get permission from the general staff to ask him such questions. Major Mitia, as he escorted the American officer to his vehicle, acted apologetic about the fact that he could not provide more facts about El Mozote, but he was sure that RO understood that LTC Monterosa had been what LTC Monterosa had been talking about. In his summary, McKay notes that the 2 hours spent with these officers was interesting, to say the least. The nuances, subtleties, and indirect comparisons used by LTC Monterosa and Major Azmitia were intriguing. Yet the central questions remain without definitive answers. Here the officer ventures a personal opinion that the Atlacado battalion, or elements thereof, participated in the attack on El Mozote. But he adds that precluding permission from General Garcia, definitive answers may never be forthcoming. Ambassador Hinton, clearly a bit frustrated now that his Mill Group commander, if it were possible high command, did not know where and when the field forces operated. No, it was not, he told me. The ambassador sent this officer to see the Salvadoran chief of staff, who informed the American that the defense minister wanted no one other than himself to deal with that question. Hinton, having been rebuffed on his subordinates' level, now paid a personal visit to General Garcia. We joshed a bit, as is our wont, reports Hinton, describing how the general complimented him on my Washington Post interview, which he said put things exactly right. Hinton reminds the general that Tom Enders had today gone to Congress to defend the additional $55 million in military assistance, and that in this connection, reports published in the Washington Post and the New York Times about alleged Morazan massacre caused great concern. Garcia replied, according to Hinton, that the Morazan business was a novella, pure Marxist propaganda devoid of foundation. I said it was clearly propaganda, that its timing had been carefully calculated, but there were so many details that it was difficult to deal with the stories. The ambassador now asked the general about some of these details, including the identity, among others, of Major Caceres. The general replied that Caceres is a straightforward, honorable soldier who would never have killed women and children as described in the story. After some discussion, General Garcia acknowledges that the Atlacado battalion had been at El Mozote during the December sweep, but then he reiterated that the story was a pack of lies. Garcia does promise the ambassador that he will look into the matter further. He asked me to leave with him the stories, and I did so, adding as a sweetener the Washington Post editorial of January the 29th supporting our common policies. One gets a vivid sense from these cables of the frustrating position the Americans had placed themselves in their dealings with the Salvadoran military. The Salvadorans have behaved with an arrogance that bespeaks their awareness of their own power. Washington was behind them, and they knew it. Why should they comply with these local officials except in those cases where they absolutely had to? In the case of El Mozote, it was already clear that they didn't have to. Greentree remembers thinking, as he said in the helicopter on the way back to the capital for Morazan, that if we're really going to have to, if we're really going to get to the bottom of this, there's going to have to be a decision to put a tremendous amount of energy into it. So carry out a more formal investigation like the ones conducted for the Americans and the 4 church women. I remember feeling frustrated and dissatisfied that what we came back with, but if we wanted to go any further with it, it would have taken a decision to expend a tremendous amount of effort. No such decision was made. Everything in the end would depend on Greentree and McKay's one-day mission to Morazan and the guerrilla presence there, together with the recalcitrance of the Salvadoran soldiers, ensured that the missions would not provide evidence considered sufficient to prove something happened. In the end, we went up there and didn't want to find that anything horrible had happened. Colonel McKay told me, and the fact that we didn't get to the site turned out to be very detrimental to our reporting. The Salvadorans, you know, were never very good about cleaning up their shell casings. 2 days after Greentree's cable arrived at the State Department, Assistant Secretary Thomas O. Enders went up to Capitol Hill. Sitting before the House Subcommittee on Inter-American Affairs, he set out to defend the president's certification that the Salvadoran government was making a concerted and significant effort to comply with internationally recognized human rights. Since the law, unfortunately, did not set out in clear terms how such an assertion was to be proved, or judged, Secretary Enders proposed to offer to the Congress a coherent attempt to answer the questions that you have raised. Are we getting some results? Results he would interpret to mean improvement. Thus, he would be arguing in essence that however horrendous the human rights situation might now be in El Salvador, the last year had in fact been less horrendous than the year before. The effect of this argument was to shift the ground of the debate. Previously, it had been, we think this human rights thing is important and you don't think it's that important. Aryeh Nir, then the director of American Watch, told me. What the Reagan administration did was embrace the principle of human rights and then conduct warfare over the facts. The fight over El Mozote exemplified this. The human rights groups had geared up to fight this new war. American Watch, for example, which had been founded only the summer before, issued a book-length study, Report on Human Rights in El Salvador, on January the 26th, 2 days before the certification was sent up to Congress. For the human rights groups and for leading Democratic congressmen, as well as for the administration officials, the fight would center on information and how it was gathered. Accurate information, Secretary Enders began, I think we all have found out that is very hard to establish. The responsibility for the overwhelming number of deaths is never legally determined, nor usually accounted for by clear or coherent evidence. 70% of the political murders known to our embassy were committed by unknown assailants. As in the cable, the fact that the killers' identities could not be definitively known, though in most cases few doubted who the killers were, was used as a shield to excuse to ignore what was known. In the absence of conclusive, undeniable proof, the government would feel free to assert that all was darkness. The Secretary then attacked by name most of the better-known human rights organizations. There is a lot of special pleading going on, as he put it. Socorro Juridico strangely lists no victims of terrorist violence, while the Human Rights Commission has become itself a propaganda vehicle for the insurgency. The Amnesty International report, a very thorough book-length study, is without historical reference. The most difficult of all to assess, the Secretary went on, are the repeated allegations of massacres. The ambiguity lies in the fact that there are indeed incidents in which the non-combatants have suffered terribly at the hands of guerrillas, rightist vigilantes, government forces, or some or all of them, but at the same time the insurgency has repeatedly fabricated or inflated alleged mass murders as a means of propaganda. We sent 2 embassy officers down to investigate the reports of the massacre in Mozote. The Secretary went on, "It is clear from the report that they gave that there has been a confrontation between the guerrillas occupying Mozote and the attacking government forces last December. There is no evidence to confirm that government forces systematically massacred civilians in the operation zone, or that the number of civilians remotely approached the 733 or 926 victims cited in the press. Echoing the strategy suggested in Greentree's cable, Enders went on. I note they asked how many people there were in that canton and were told probably not more than 300 in December. And there are many survivors, including refugees, now. So we have to be careful about trying to adduce evidence to the certification. Our embassy tries to investigate every report we receive. 6 days later, Elliot Abrams, the Assistant Secretary of State in Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, remarked to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the El Mozote case is a very interesting one in a sense because we found, for example, what the numbers, first of all, were not credible because, as Secretary Enders notes, our information was that there were only 300 people in the canton. The argument about numbers is, of course, deeply misleading. No one who read the Times and the Post articles could have missed the fact that the killing had taken place in several hamlets. 2 of the 3 survivors, Guillermo Prieto quoted, for example, were from La Joya, not El Mozote. But the argument exemplifies a pattern, claiming to have investigated the facts and to have found no evidence of a massacre. American officials then seized the aspects of the charges they said reveal to be propaganda. We find that it is an event that happened in mid-December, but it is then publicized when the certification comes forward to the committee. Abrams told the Senate, so it appears to be an indictment which is at least significantly misused in the very best by the guerrillas. In an interview more than a decade later, Abrams made the same argument. He pointed out that the massacre had supposedly taken place in December and asked, if it had really been a massacre and not a firefight, why didn't we hear right off from the FMLN? I mean, we didn't start hearing about it until a month later. As has been noted, the guerrillas first publicized the massacre about 2 weeks after the event, as soon as they had got Radio Vinqueremos back on the air. All the same, it is indisputable that the volume of reporting about El Mozote from Vinqueremos, from human rights groups and from the international press grew steadily throughout January and reached a crescendo the day before Reagan's certification. with the front page stories on the Post and the Times. Certainly a significant part of this publicity, it is impossible to say how much was owing directly and indirectly to the efforts of those beginning with the guerrillas and their international propaganda apparatus, who had a strong interest in derailing the administration's policy in El Salvador. But administration officials focused obsessively on this unsurprising reality, and in the very fact that the El Mozote story was being used as propaganda, that it was, as Abrams put it, significantly misused by the guerrillas, in itself constituted proof that the massacre hadn't taken place. This is not surprising to many in the administration. The importance of the massacre was that it had such propaganda value, and that the propaganda coming at a crucial time posed a threat to American aid. Preserving the Salvadoran government and helping it win the war were paramount. Improving human rights naturally took a back seat since, as the administration liked to put it, by far the worst disaster that could befall human rights in El Salvador was a communist victory. This attitude was no mystery to the Salvadoran leaders, despite the periodic brouhahas over certain atrocities. They could see the bottom line quite clearly, which was, as Abrams phrased it, that whatever you think of us from a human rights point of view, what you think of us from a security point of view is determinative. To say the least, this attitude did not encourage anyone in the State Department to make any additional effort to find out what had happened at El Mozote. As far as the department officials were concerned, Greentree's cable was the end of the matter. Even had Abrams been a very different kind of man, even had he been inclined to press an investigation, he had been in office barely a month, and his Human Rights Bureau was barely staffed. It had been without a chief for 10 months because of a bruising Senate fight over Reagan's first nominee, and, as he told me, he received only the cable traffic that the Latin American bureaus wanted us to get. In any event, the key cable, the Greentree cable, had come from Hinton's embassy, and Hinton had a great deal of prestige in the department. By now, however, Hinton himself had taken a rather different view. I would be grateful if the department would use extreme care in describing my views on alleged massacre, he cabled on February the 1st. Apparently, Washington had sent out cables saying that the ambassador, in his reply to the National Council of Churches, had denied the massacre had taken place. My letter did not deny incident. It reported that at that time I had no confirmation and had no reason to believe Vinqueremos' reports. I still don't believe Vinqueremos' version, but additional evidence strongly suggests that something happened that should not have happened, and that it is quite possible Salvadoran military did commit excesses. Not only McKay and Greentree, but how Hinton himself had come to that conclusion that something happened at El Mozote, and Hinton had now told the State Department so. To this, he added his blunt appraisal of the Salvadoran officer's credibility. I find Garcia's assertion, "We have absolutely no information on military actions in El Mozote," to be stonewalling without credibility. I have tried to warn him we need to face up to problem, but my impression is that he thinks categoric denial is way to handle question. Department officers may wish to discuss matter with him before U.S. press gets to him. As it happened, however, department officers seem to have agreed with General Garcia. They had the Green Tree cable and they would make use of it. After all, the question would come down to, as Abrams put it to me, do you believe the embassy and agency of the United States government or America's Watch? America's Watch and other human rights organizations, Abrams said, did not have a great deal of credibility with us, for in his view they had ranged themselves on the side of those who argued in effect for an FMLN victory, and thus they served as willing tools of the hypocrites in Congress who now forced administration officials to undergo a meaningless certification exercise. Certification was this political game they were playing. Howard Lane, the embassy press officer, told me, everybody knew, Congress knew, what they, the Salvadoran government, were doing down there. By then, they had to know, unless they refused to see it. So they beat their breasts and tore their hair and yelled about human rights and made us jump through this hoop called certification. If any ambassador wanted to keep his job, he had to jump, which meant essentially saying the half-empty glass was really half full. It was a game. Improvement? What's improvement anyway? You kill 800 and it goes down to 200? That's improvement? The whole thing was an exercise in the absurd. So the officials went to the Hill and made their case, resenting not only the men interrogating them, but their own superiors. I remember Enders and I were chatting, Abrams said, and I said, I'm delighted to go up there and support the thing, but why is it just us? There's the undersecretary, the upper ranks. And Enders said to me, it's a dirty little war and they don't want to touch it. Enders told me that James Baker, then White House Chief of Staff, consciously steered Reagan away from Central America. I couldn't even get Duarte's picture taken with Reagan the first year. The climate was so dominated by charges of violence that the White House didn't want anything to do with it. Ever the good soldier, Enders on Capitol Hill attacked the numbers from the human rights groups, put forward the administration's numbers, explained how, despite all appearances, the Salvadoran government was making progress. he testified the results are slow in coming. I would agree with you on that, but they are coming. The figures show it. We have September, October, November, December figures for 1980, which show something on the order of 800, 779, 575, and 665 political murders. That is for 1980. We have the same figures for this year, which show September 171, October 161, November 302. It shows December 200. Our returns are showing markedly different numbers in the same methodology. That methodology, as anyone who has looked into it knew, was very obviously flawed. The administration numbers drawn from the embassy's weekly Gram were based on reports in the Salvadoran newspapers, all of which now only ranged from conservative to unabashedly right-wing, but weighted their reporting toward the cities. In 1981, fewer people were being killed in the cities because fewer activists were there to be killed. Most of those who had not been liquidated in late 1979 or 1980 had moved to the mountains, and the killings in the mountains, in the isolated hamlets and villages, rarely reached the pages of the newspapers in the capital. Let me be clear, this is not a complete report, Enders told Congress. Nobody has a complete report. But, nonetheless, it is a coherent attempt to answer the question that you have raised. Are we getting some results? This is the indication that I submit to you that we are. To this statement, a number of congressmen responded with outraged eloquence. Jerry Studs, Democrat of Massachusetts, told Enders, "If there is anything left of the English language in this city, it is gone now, because the president has just certified that up is down and that and in is out and black is white. I anticipate him telling us that the war is peace at any moment." It is an irresistible quote, and it made for great television, but it didn't make any difference. Enders had supplied a coherent attempt to answer the question that Congress had posed. And though Democratic congressmen would not spare their voices or their sarcasm in noting the Orwellian tones of this certification, as Stephen Solers, Democrat of New York, put it, though congressmen attacked the numbers and the methodology and the hearings became contentious and angry, it is clear that come what may, there would not be the votes to cut off aid to El Salvador, for that, as everybody knew, would mean losing the country to the communists. At root, nearly everyone tacitly agreed, the Democrats who purported loss, of China 3 decades before was still a painful party memory, no less than the Republican administration and its allies, that eventuality was too intolerable even to contemplate, and that in the end the Salvadoran government, by whatever means, had to win the war, or the country's security would be unacceptably threatened. And so, because of this underlying argument, the entire debate, loud and angry as it appeared at first glance, was not a debate. It was an exercise for the cameras. As for El Mozote, since the Salvadoran newspapers said nothing about it, those who had died there merited no place in the number Secretary Enders brought to Congress. Had the massacre somehow been proved to the State Department's satisfaction, had it been somehow impossible for the administration to deny, El Mozote would have had so ugly and on the administration's numbers, political murders would have shown as increase in December from 665 well over 1,000, rather than the sharp decline he claimed. Would this have led Congress to reject the certification and cut off aid? Reading the record now, feeling once again that fear in Washington of an FMLN victory and of the blame such a victory might impose on American politicians, the question seems sadly difficult to answer. Aid might have been reduced, true, but at most Congress might have managed to cut off aid temporarily, only to restore it again in a panic, as Carter had done at the first new guerrilla onslaught. But this is speculation. In the event the dead of El Mozote had not really come into the discussion at all. But we'll go ahead and end the episode on that note, because we are coming close to the end of the chapter. Yeah, so next episode should end that chapter. So we are seeing the combative views by the administration and human rights groups and the press. You know, they're like, look, human rights don't matter right now. We're trying to stop the march of communism. And it's like, that is a stupid excuse. But it's what they pushed. It's like, look, we have only one choice, and that's to keep pressure on the guerrilla forces and to keep communism out of El Salvador. Again, this was during the age of still trying to fight against communism, even though In truth, the USSR was already a fading country. But yeah, you can see how the military and the administration was so driven to try to control the narrative. It's really ridiculous. But, as always, boop, educate thyself, think, read, study, learn. Someone tells you something you have trouble believing, ask them to cite their sources. I appreciate y'all for watching. I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, later.